evening. Thank you for joining us. Our speakers are taking their places. Meantime, I'm happy to say hello and welcome you to tonight's program. I'm Mary Clark, and I'm the Provost and Executive Vice Chancellor here at the university. You may wonder, what is a provost? I'm the Chief Academic Officer, so I work with all of the schools and colleges, our faculty, and our students. So delighted to see you all here this evening and to welcome you to the University of Denver and naturally to the Joseph Corbell School of International Studies. So thank you. The university takes great pride in the Center for Middle East Studies. And tonight's program, of course, is hosted by the Center for Middle East Studies. And I would love to take this moment to salute its faculty director, Dr. Micheline Ishay, who has put on a series of programs this year, and especially post-dating October 7th, for us to gain understanding and insight into what happened, what is the impact of what happened, what possible solutions might there be moving forward? What are the implications of what happened and what is continuing to unfold in Israel and Gaza? So I'd love to take this moment to salute Micheline for all that she's done and all of the thought leadership that you have provided. So it's a pleasure and an honor working with you. So thank you, Micheline. And I'm also pleased to introduce this evening Dr. Ahmed Abd Rabu, who will be introducing today's panelists. Ahmed is a teaching assistant professor here at the Joseph Corbell School of International Studies. He has published several articles on democratization in Egypt in particular and Arab nations more broadly. These have been published in peer-reviewed journals, so I'm sure you've seen them, or you can look for them online or in our library. He is also known among Middle East scholars for his specialization in civil-military relations, political Islam, and democratization in the Middle East, again, more broadly. That is the area where he focuses his research. His most recent books are Good Governance and Civil Security Relations, a comparative study of Turkey and Egypt, published by Routledge Press in 2021, and The Modern History of Egypt, published in 2024. I'm impressed. So I'd love to welcome Ahmed up to the podium, and I turn the program over to you. Thank you.
Thanks, everyone. And for those who celebrate Eid al-Fitr, congratulations, and you have some food to break your fast. Hopefully some are still left. So let me, I'm mainly introducing our speakers, our moderator, and maybe you will see me back for the Q&A. So let me first introduce Professor Micheline Ishay. Would you go to the, okay. So Dr. Ishay is the director of the Center for of Middle East Studies and the main moderator today. She's a professor of international studies and human rights at Joseph Corbell School of International Studies, University of Denver. She's the author of half a dozen of books, including Internationalism and Its Betrayal, The Nationalism Reader, and The Levant Express, which is my favorite book. Not to suggest that her other books are not interesting, but this one especially is very interesting to me. And the full title, by the way, for this book is The Levant Express, Arab Uprisings, Human Rights, and the Future of the Middle East. Her books, The History of Human Rights from Ancient Times to the Globalization Era, and The Human Rights Reader, Major Political Essays, Speeches, and Documents from Ancient Times to the Present, have been translated into multiple languages and published in second or third editions. Next, let me welcome General George Casey, who is a published author and authority on strategic leadership. He currently serves as a distinguished scholar, distinguished senior lecturer on leadership at the S.C. Johnson College of Business, Cornell University. And he lectures on leadership to national and international business leaders. He also lectures on civil military relations, and we overlap here, at the Corbell School. He served for 41 years in the U.S. Army, ending his career as the 36th Army Chief of Staff. He also commanded the multinational force in Iraq, a coalition of more than 30 countries, in addition to numerous operational assignments in the United States and overseas. Next, Dr. Goldfischer, who is a professor at Cornell, and he also published many articles and books, and his work is mainly focusing on US national security, including nuclear weapons and arms control, homeland security, and US policy in the Middle East. He has worked on post-9/11 threats as a visiting professor of counterterrorism at National Defense University and as a consultant to US Northern Command and the Department of Homeland Security. From 2010 to 2013, he served as a founding director of the Institute on International and Civil Security in Abu Dhabi, United Arab Emirates, and as the first security studies think tank and graduate program. Last but not least, Ambassador Gary Grappo, who is a former US ambassador and since 2016 a distinguished fellow at the Center for Middle East Studies. As a career member of the Senior Foreign Service of the United States Department of State, he served as an envoy and head of mission of the Office of the Quartet representative in Jerusalem, Israel. He was a minister counselor for political affairs at the US Embassy in Baghdad, Iraq, and US ambassador to the Sultanate of Oman, and charge d'affaires and deputy chief of mission of the United States Embassy in Riyadh, Kingdom of Saudi Arabia. In Washington, he served as director of the Office of Regional Affairs of the Near East Asia Bureau of Department of State. Ambassador Grappo is also a veteran of 8 years in the US Air Force. So please join me in welcoming our distinguished speakers. And with that, I turn the mic to Professor Ishay.
Good evening, Denver, and those of us who are joining us on the webinar. It's great to see once again a very nice full house. Just really makes us feel wonderful. And Provost Clark, once again, your support and your wonderful introductions really mean a lot of us, particularly in times of volatility in the regions and trying to figure out how to navigate the public is not an easy task, and your continuous support is highly appreciated, and thank you for that. Before I start going to the panel, I know you're all eager. This is a really distinguished panel and very excited to see what they're going to tell us. But I want to just first to thank the team of students who helped organize the event. I really want to insist on them because this is an operation that is really driven by students. They're absolutely terrific. Our student maestro, you can stand up. I think he's stand up. It's Micah de Breber and his team, Zaria, Adzel, and I would like to thank other students who volunteered, Juliet, Aram, and Elise. This event literally could not have happened without you and our man behind the camera. Or is he still behind the camera, Treman, or and his team? So thank you again for coming again and doing this wonderful YouTube. So for those of you who are missing something, you don't need to just do all of it on your iPhone. You can actually see the event on YouTube. It will be done very well. So a brief introduction on a very interesting and important topic of the United States changing role in the Middle East. So by way of brief introduction, this is what I would like to suggest. First of all, if we look from 1945 to 2001, the United States strategy in the Middle East focused primarily on two objectives. The first focused on containing threat that could ultimately affect the access to oil, from the Soviet Union, then from Ayatollah Khomeini's Iran in 1979, and finally from Iraq under Saddam Hussein. The second goal was to manage and hopefully resolve the post-1948 Israeli-Arab conflict by mediating peace processes between Israel and its neighbors and enhance regional stability. In 2001, there was another threat or perceived threat that came through one of America's friends, Saudi Arabia. And despite having allied with the United States to support the anti-Soviet insurgency of in Afghanistan and sharing concern about Iran, Saudi Arabia continued to export at the time military and anti-Western Wahhabist Islamism, setting the stage for the September 11th attack on America. After that attack, the United States attempted, under President George W. Bush, a revolutionary democratic transformations of the Middle East that was supposed to be achieved somewhat by invading Afghanistan in 2001 and toppling Saddam Hussein. The 2003 Iraq intervention turned the country into a battleground between Al-Qaeda in Mesopotamia and militant Shia extremists, largely controlled by Iran, when the US finally withdrew a neoliberal democracy predicated on the disenfranchisement of Sunnis and Kurds. So from 2009 and 2016, as the United States lessened its dependence on Middle Eastern oil and perceived China as an emerging threat, President Obama sought a strategy of military disengagement and a shift toward Asia. While reaching a diplomatic agreement to prevent Iran's nuclear weapon, his policy collapsed in the wake of the Arab uprisings, the war in Syria, and the rise of ISIS. The United States resumed its military engagement to defeat ISIS, first under Obama and then under Trump. The Trump administration helped in some way to achieve the Abraham Accords, which normalized Israel's relationship with 4 Arab states, but overlooked the Palestinian issue. He also sought but failed to prevent Iran's growing influence in the region as Iran continued its long proxy wars against Saudi Arabia, other Sunni-led Arab states, and Israel yielding ongoing conflict in the regions until today. Despite the US withdrawal from Afghanistan after 20 years of war, October 7, 2023 marked a renewal of US involvement in the Middle East. President Biden rushed to show solidarity with the Israeli states, assisting with weapons, dispatching aircraft, and helping to negotiate hostage release and humanitarian aid. This renewed focus on the Middle East raises a series of questions regarding the role of the United States in the region. We're here very privileged today to entertain a conversation about the United States' changing role in the Middle East with leading experts on the subjects. So while I take my seat, you can applaud our expert. Okay. Hello? Okay.
Yeah.
All right. What I'm going to do today is just ask a series of questions, some to all of the panelists, a similar question to all the panelists, and then question directed to specific individuals. But you can all jump in and weigh in once I do that. Okay. So, drawing from my last remarks on the podium, Obama called a new US policy pivoting from the Middle East to Asia. It has not happened. But was he right? General Casey, do you want to start?
Hi, everybody. Nice to be with you. Some people probably wondering how the general wound up here. I graduated from here in 1980. And one of my classmates is here, Bob Minch. We haven't seen each other since graduation, but he's kind enough to come out here. In general, I'll try to give you a military perspective on all of these security issues. So, have we made a successful pivot to China? I mean, I would say yes, but yes from the perspective of the focus of the Pentagon and the combatant commands, and frankly, the allocation of the budget. And the defense budget is increasingly going to purchase systems that would be used in conflict in the Asia-Pacific region. Now, as Micheline so articulately pointed out there, the Middle East is a tar baby. I mean, you may want to get out, but it keeps dragging you back in, and that's, I think, what we're seeing now. So.
Thank you, Ambassador. Grappo?
If by pivot you mean we turn our back on other interests and focus on China, no, we're not doing that. The United States cannot afford to do that. Given our status in the world today, still as the major superpower, we have too many interests, too many responsibilities, obligations, and opportunities in the world. We cannot afford to turn our backs on any part of the world. But in particular, with respect to the Middle East, as the general has pointed out, it's just once we got involved in the Middle East in the early 1950s, when President Eisenhower first dispatched U.S. Marines to a brewing civil war, which we fortunately were able to head off in the 1950s, it's been a ball and chain around America's ankles. And we've never been able to shake the Middle East, and we seem to get deeper and deeper into it. I will say that when President Obama made that statement about pivoting to Asia, it was most definitely called for in terms of increased focus and attention to the Middle East, given the existential competition, I think is the word that the administration is using, that we face with respect to China, but we cannot afford to turn our backs on the Middle East. I would agree with the general. If you look at President Biden's national security strategy, the biggest section in there is dealing with the Indo-Pacific, specifically with China. The Middle East is in there. I think it's like third place, and that's mostly because of Iran. This is pre-October 7th. So the United States is not leaving the Middle East. It cannot afford to leave the Middle East. We still have the largest military presence in the Middle East, even though we certainly do not have the forces deployed there that we once did between Iraq and Afghanistan. We are the most strongly represented diplomatically throughout the region and the most recognized throughout the region. Finally, I will say that in a poll that was recently conducted about how people of the Middle East view the United States, and in particular our policy, needless to say, well, we didn't, because of what's transpiring now in the war in Gaza, President Biden did not fare very well. But it juxtaposed to that, very interestingly, when they posed the question, which country do the people of the Middle East look to bring stability? It's us again. It's that old refrain, you can cue the song, Hotel California, because they're still looking toward us, almost 45% of the people in the Middle East, despite a lot of the criticism we've taken for our policy with respect to the war in Gaza. China was a distant 28% or something, and Russia was low single digits. So we still are looked to by the countries in the Middle East, and I think that's pretty evident given what we're seeing in terms of U.S. activity in trying to resolve the conflict in Gaza.
Thank you very much. Condoleezza Rice said we were the 9/11 of the world. Don't we spread too much in the United States? And Gary Grappo talks about the Eagles, the American Eagles. Is that the correct involvement? Is that part of the United States interest really to be as involved as we are today?
Since I agree with everything that's been said, well, I'll maybe just frame that, but I want to point out that the national interest of the U.S. is not a given. It's not assigned to us. The national interest of the United States is not sort of assigned. The realist school of international studies would say that's sort of a given. It just happens that President Truman, continuing really what had been inspired by his predecessor, FDR, decided that the U.S. would assume an enduring world leadership role after World War II. For the Middle East, the most obvious issue was the need for a steady flow of oil from the Middle East at affordable prices on which the world economy relied. And that goes back to FDR meeting with the first president of modern Saudi Arabia on a boat in the Nile in 1945, a few weeks before he died. Basically, you provide the oil, we'll provide you with security. And this fundamental engagement in that region, as well as its global engagement, has continued ever since. But again, it's not given. And when we are tempted to say we as the United States, we may have President Trump again next year. In that case, if I'm asked about the pivot to Asia, I'll simply say not needed. Japan can get nukes. South Korea can get nuclear weapons. And then, you know, China can do whatever the hell it wants. As far as the Middle East, I'm very interested in the Saudi Sovereign Wealth Fund. They have that now. They gave $2 billion to my son-in-law. I think there's more there. They formed this great thing, the LIV Golf Tour. It's going to supplant the PGA, and I think they're going to do a lot of their stuff on my golf courses. Erdogan called me way back in my first administration, and he said, could you get out of northern Syria? I want to clear out some Kurdish terrorists there who are a threat to me. I asked him if my hotel project in Istanbul was alive. He said, yeah. I announced the pullout the next day. Iran, yeah, I really rode that Iran deal, worst deal in the history of the United States. I rode that pretty hard. I went after Iran, but then I appointed these guys, Pompeo and Bolton. They wanted war. They wanted regime change. I mean, to hell with that. I got rid of Bolton, and I'm not going that way again. My base doesn't want a war over there. They don't want anything over there. That leaves Israel. I was gung-ho for Israel, but then Bibi made a kind of fatal mistake. He congratulated Biden in 2020 after I won. And I haven't sorted that one out yet, but the point is that whatever we may envision as almost a given as a set of U.S. interest in the region is not given. It's very much up in the air, and the shadow of that hangs over all of the regions. It hangs over Europe, it hangs over Japan with their leader visiting today, and it hangs over the Middle East as well.
Well, thank you, Mr. Trump. Okay, we're almost a Saturday Night Live here, so just be ready.
It took me a while to figure out you were in character.
So, General Casey, let me just move a little bit to the regional concern and ask you first here whether in Iraq and Afghanistan, American military intervention in the Middle East has led to disasters. So at the same time, some would argue that when the United States fails to intervene, as in the civil war in Syria, the Middle East is even in further disarray, as Mr. Trump might suggest. What are the lessons for the future of US military intervention in the region?
Yeah,
and as for today, so I'm going to just add that question, you can cover all of it. How is Biden faring on addressing Iran's proxy attacks?
Yeah, good, all good questions. So when I took over the Army in 2007, I was struggling to define how I thought the world would look like 10 years down the road, so because that's what I had to build the Army for. And I came up with a term I call persistent conflict, that we were going to face years of what I call protracted confrontation among states, non-states, and individual actors who were increasingly willing to use violence to accomplish their political and ideological objectives. And as I look at what's going on across the Middle East today, I'm seeing that in spades. Obviously, Israel-Hamas is going on right now. It's in its 6 months. And it's in response to a terrorist attack against the state by a non-state actor that murdered 1,200 people and kidnapped 250 more. Syria is basically a security vacuum, and it's being filled by Iran. Iran is the center of the conflict in the Middle East. And they are actively pursuing, in my view, actively pursuing a strategy to destabilize the Middle East, to get us, the United States, out of the Middle East, and to threaten Israel's right to continue to exist. Afghanistan, just outside, is under the control of a terrorist organization. Iraq, might have started out as a disaster, but right now, today, it's one of 3 democracies in the Middle East, and I'd put it at number 2. And who are we to look at others and criticize how their democracy is running? So I see this persistent conflict here, and I see Iran at the center of it in the Middle East. And I also come to that from my personal experience dealing with Iran when I was in Iraq. And it was clear to us after a short time that Iran was there to cause us to fail. They wanted the United States to fail in Iraq. And they had a strategy, kind of a 3-pronged strategy, where they bought political influence. They paid off Iraqi political leaders. They bought public support through economic actions down in the southern part of the country. And they basically trained and provided military aid to the Shia militias that kept the sectarian violence alive. And particularly frustrating was they provided the Iraqi militia military material that they couldn't get themselves, particularly an explosively formed penetrator, which is a particularly deadly improvised explosive device. And I believe that Iran's efforts in Iraq is directly responsible for the deaths of hundreds of U.S. soldiers and thousands of Iraqis. So what's the lesson? And the lesson is one that I learned in Bosnia as a brigadier. We, the United States, can't want something in someone else's country more than they want it themselves. We can help them, but we can't want it more than they do. They have to be the ones that step up. So for me, the lesson going forward is we need to pay close attention to the limits of U.S. power, what we're really able to accomplish, and particularly the limits of U.S. military power. There are things we can do militarily, but we can't work political solutions. So that would be my answer, Micheline.
Well, thank you very much. And on the subject of Iran, I'm going to just move then to David Goldfischer, who writes a lot about our nuclear deal. Obama signed a nuclear deal with Iran. Trump withdrew from it. And what is happening now under Biden? What should be U.S. policy today regarding Iran, generally speaking, and with specifically regarding the nuclear deal?
Yeah, okay, let me just begin by saying just a minute or less on the background. Iran was heading towards acquiring nuclear weapons. The Obama administration initiated a prolonged negotiation involving not just the U.S. and Iran, but including China, Russia, and essentially Europe, mainly Germany and Great Britain and France. It's amazing to look back. That agreement was finally formalized in 2015, and you can almost be nostalgic for a moment where the great powers could share a common interest, pursue it actively, and reach a very important agreement that helped stabilize the region. Forgetting all the intricacies of the agreement, essentially it prevented Iran from enriching uranium even remotely close to the level needed to create a bomb until 2031, and preclude production of plutonium also until 2031. It came under great attack in the region. The Saudis, the Emiratis, and the Israelis opposed it intensely, and were largely joined by the Republicans. In a way, it was the beginning of this split in Israel where Netanyahu identifies with the Republican Party, and kind of an entry into American politics where it was no longer a common U.S. view, it was a partisan view. And that legacy we can see actually operating to this day, a very dangerous one. Trump ran for office among his other platforms, as I mentioned, deriding the Iran deal, the worst deal in history. After I'd come back from the UAE in 2013, I had written a couple of articles, was going to leave that stuff behind for a while, was working on something when I heard Trump on television and explaining why the US was leaving the deal, and I just heard lie after lie about the deal. That's when I first wrote my first op-ed for the Denver Post in like an hour. I was so upset with that. Well, things were proceeded for a couple of years. It was a little unclear. That was 2018. January 2020, the United States decided to assassinate Suleiman, head of the Revolutionary Guard Corps of Iran, and they immediately began, in retaliation, enriching their level of uranium, not to weapons grade, but kind of going up, I think, to 60%. You have to hit 90%. Biden ran for office in 2020, saying he wanted to revive and expand that deal. The controversial issue was that Iran, of course, was continuing massive manufacture of missiles. As the general explained, it was helping these militias throughout the region in a kind of expansionist campaign. It proved impossible to integrate those issues, to restore, even before October 7th, negotiations were floundering. In the wake of October 7th, the situation has changed dramatically. It's unthinkable to continue that. And unfortunately, Iran is now on the verge. Actually, this morning, I just looked at some reasonably authoritative websites to see what the guesses were, and I saw guesses that Iran is between 3 days and 3 weeks away from acquiring the weapons level of uranium enrichment, maybe a few more weeks to produce a crude bomb if they wish to go in that direction. To actually weaponize it in terms of a warhead, people are estimating 1 to 2 years or even more. But they are sitting there at the edge now of having the capacity to build a nuclear weapon. One can hope that they have good reasons for prudence and restraint to not cross that line, but that's their judgment, and that's where we are right now.
Okay, thank you. A very daunting prospect. Let me turn to you, Gary Grappo, ambassador. That suggests what David is telling us. It's suggesting that the part of the threat is also coincide with a change in the geopolitical configurations of the Middle East. And that has certainly been intensified after October 7. Can you tell us how, and what should the United States short-term and long-term diplomatic strategy be to strengthen prospect for regional peace and stability? I understand it's a very ambitious question, therefore an ambitious answer. You have 1 minute.
At the State Department, we always had grand ambitions. But I will say in terms of October 7th and how things changed, not only in the region, but for the United States in the region, I go back to 2011, not when President Obama made his speech about a pivot to Asia, but when he made the decision that the United States would not support Hosni Mubarak in Egypt. Up to that point, most of our friends and allies in the region had placed a lot of trust and confidence in the United States that we would come to their aid if they were threatened. Hosni Mubarak was threatened. We had millions of Egyptians in the streets calling for his removal or resignation, and the United States essentially supported the people of Egypt. For a very simple reason, we saw this as a democratic movement. The United States is not going to oppose a democratic movement, even in a country whose leader was a very strong friend and ally of the United States. When the Saudis saw that, and the Emiratis and a number of other countries, it forced all of them to rethink their relationship with the United States. And it was the beginning of a movement from a unipolar region, where the United States was a dominant hegemon, to a more multipolar region, where you had many states competing, the United States still preeminent among them in terms of power and influence. But Saudi Arabia had a far more active foreign policy. They used to consult with us before they took any initiatives. Not anymore. United Emirates did the same thing. Turkey became extremely active, and we already have spoken about Iran and its involvement in the region, particularly with this axis of resistance, which I would argue is probably far more effective than a nuclear weapon would be. So we have this multipolar region where US influence and power was questioned, and some people even talked about the end of the United States in the Middle East. And then we had October 7th, and now it's a non-polar region. There is no dominant power. I mean, the United States is still the preeminent power, but I wouldn't say it dominates. China and Russia, who thought they saw an opening in the region with the diminished role of the United States, or the perceived diminished role of the United States, are nowhere to be seen now. In fact, the only time you'll hear about Russia or China when it comes to the war in Gaza is to criticize US policy. They're doing nothing constructive. No initiatives, no ideas, just criticize the United States. Iran continues to play its very troublesome role to frustrate and to disrupt. Nothing constructive, and I would never expect them to be constructive. And the Gulf countries, as wealthy as they may be and as assertive as they appear to be, are still pretty feckless, disorganized, weak, and distrusting of one another, which they've actually been for a long time. So, as I said earlier, the countries in the region are turning to the United States. And who is playing the role of facilitator in terms of perhaps trying to reach a ceasefire and achieve a release of the hostages in Gaza? It's the United States, as we have done before, working with partners with whom we've worked in the past, in this case, Egypt and Qatar. So the United States probably is going to be forced into a role we thought we had left behind, but can't seem to shake. And you can argue whether we have the interest there. Clearly, every president but one has thought we did. And this one certainly certainly believes that we do. And most of the countries in the region want us to defend our interest, and hopefully theirs, in the Middle East. Another allegory I often raise when I talk about the United States in the Middle East is Gulliver in the land of the Lilliputians. If you recall your story from Jonathan Swift, the Lilliputians went after Gulliver because they wanted Gulliver to defend them against the giants. Who does that remind you of in the Middle East? And we are tied down by the Lilliputians, all of them, from Morocco all the way to the Gulf, and can't seem to extricate ourselves, and won't be able to for a considerable period of time. The United States plan going forward, I give President Biden actually pretty high marks, and I know he's come in for a lot of criticism, some of it probably deserved, but not all of it. But when I start hearing criticism from the left and the right and from the Middle East, I start to think, well, maybe the guy's doing something right, because he's really managing to infuriate people on both sides, which suggests to me that he's putting forward the really hard ideas that need to be heard. And in the short term, that is going to be achieving a ceasefire and a release of as many hostages as possible. Very disturbing news today about Hamas saying they only have 40 hostages, so it begs the question, where are the other 60? Do other groups like the Palestinian Islamic Jihad have them, or are they still alive? And then secondly, with a ceasefire in place, start getting the relevant parties to doing the really, really hard work with a low probability of success. I'll tell you right now, very low probability, maybe 5% of success, to start working together on a more permanent solution.
Thank you so much. I would like to ask the audience, because we're going to just collect questions. If you can start writing, there are just little papers, little cards underneath your seats. You can start writing questions, and then we will collect them later. I'm going to move to a different subject for our panelists. Interesting to hear from Gary Grappo that the United States is perceived as, entrapped by Lilliputian, when in the university setting, it's always about American imperialism. So refreshing, it comes from a different perspective, obviously, and we will probably push on this one back, certainly with the question that will come, I think, from the audience and from our moderators. But now let me just go back to the Israeli-Palestinian question, since that's where you left us with. And I will start with General Casey. Benjamin Netanyahu, to the great chagrin of Biden, has indicated strong will to continue war efforts in Rafah, and there's opposition in his cabinet, but he has been discussing that just of yesterday or today. I was going to ask you this question: how would you assess the Israeli military campaign in Gaza, generally speaking? Is the strategy for defeating Hamas military viable, and are the costs acceptable? And are there lessons from other wars that come to mind?
I'm going to give you a military perspective on this, and it is an open source perspective. Because a lot of people think when you retire as a 4-star general, they keep feeding you information. They drop you like a hot potato. So this is New York Times, Economist, Wall Street Journal kind of deep, but I'll give you my impressions, and I will tell you, as I look at this as a general, I say I'm glad I'm not an Israeli general today, because the task that they have facing them is monumental. Start from the fact that they were surprised, that they let their country down, that they allowed 250 of their fellow countrymen be captured and another 1,200 murdered. If you compare that to the population of Israel, that's 40,000 Americans that would have been killed on September 11th. Can you imagine what we would have done? And so they're starting on the back foot. Then they're forced to conduct one of probably the most difficult type of military operation. And that's urban warfare in a very densely populated area. And they're doing it under very close scrutiny by the international media. And I don't say that as a bad thing, I just say it as a reality. And then they have a responsibility to their troops to give them a mission that they can accomplish, and to give them rules of engagement that allow them to protect themselves and also to protect the people that are in the area that they're trying to take. You can't give Hamas a pass on this. Hamas is embedding themselves with the population to exacerbate the Israeli challenges as if they weren't hard enough. So facing all that, they have killed, I would say, they have killed too many civilians, and they have created a humanitarian crisis. And as they go forward, they're going to need to address both of those issues. It's hurting them strategically. So where do we go from here? My sense is right now they've cut off the northern part of Gaza, and they basically have created a buffer zone all along the border. They still have Rafah. My sense is it's too early for them to stop. They can't, to your question, they can't eradicate Hamas. That's not a militarily achievable task. Hamas is as much an idea as it is a military force. But they can reduce Hamas's capability to attack them and possibly to keep them from returning to govern Gaza. I would tell you, from my own experience, it's not too early to start thinking about what happens after the fighting's done. As I said, I do think they need to get into Rafah and eliminate the last of the battalions. And something that has been puzzling me is I have not seen on any media large weapons caches. And lots of tunnels and things, but I haven't seen large weapons caches. And they're out there. And that's Hamas's capability to continue to fight against Israel. So my view, what should we do? We have to continue to support Israel's right to secure itself. Number one responsibility of a state is to protect its population. We have to continue to pressure them to reduce civilian casualties and to take care of the humanitarian situation. And we need to work with them to keep this from escalating. And if there's any lessons to be learned, the lesson is it's not too early to start planning for what comes after the fighting stops.
Well, that's a wonderful segue to my question to Gary Grappo, who has been involved in peace processes between Israelis and Palestinians from the Madrid conference, the quartet, and beyond. And so my question to you, is Biden on the right track when he talks about the two-state solutions, or will the Bibi-Biden rift prove to be insoluble? What are your thoughts?
President Biden is on the right track, not because it's necessarily the right track, it's the only track. There are about 7 options for addressing the Israeli-Palestinian conflict. 6 of them have zero probability of success. It's anything from, well, the Hamas proposed solution, which is one state, Islamic State, and the eradication of the Israeli state, to the extremist Israeli, which is annexation of the West Bank and the expulsion of Palestinians. Those 2 are non-starters to the respective parties, and I would say to most of the civilized planet. And then there's some stuff in between. What we have seen in the last 15 years was conflict management, engineered by Bibi Netanyahu, and that has proven to be a dismal failure. Palestinian nationalism is not going away. It's been there since before 1948, and it has continued beyond 1948. And folks, I think, in the last 15 years tried to wish it away, and it hasn't gone away. And it's more evident now than it has ever been that Palestinians want their state. On the other hand, Israelis will never shy from ensuring the security of their state and the people of Israel. And so in terms of objectives for U.S. diplomacy or any other diplomacy involved in this issue, it's how to reconcile those 2. And the only way that that can be done to the satisfaction of both parties is with 2 states. And President Biden is right to emphasize that. The challenge is that he's dealing with an Israeli leader who is congenitally opposed to a Palestinian state and always has been, always. He's tried to cover it up. He's been very clever in masking it. He made a speech. In fact, I was there in Israel when he did about a 2-state solution, but if you read the fine print, there were so many caveats as to make it impossible. And the only other time that he conceded 2 states is when we came up with the deal of the century by Trump for solving the Israeli-Palestinian crisis. So the only solution left is a 2-state solution, and Bibi is an objective obstacle. He can't do it for his own personal political conviction, as I said earlier. Moreover, he cannot do it for political reasons. The minute he shows a willingness to go along with a 2-state solution or even entertain the idea, his coalition collapses and he's out of office. Although there would be a transition period before they could hold elections. So Bibi Netanyahu has lots of motivation for not for not moving in a direction that Biden would like to see him move, even though if we want to see any kind of a reconstruction exercise once this war is over, however we define the end of the war, it's going to require lots of investment, mostly from Arab European countries and the United States. And we know the Arabs and the Europeans are not going to put any more money into Gaza unless there is a confirmed horizon for a Palestinian state. That is a commitment on the part of the Israeli government to negotiate a two-state solution. Finally, I will just say that, yes, Bibi and Biden have this current row, which actually dates back a while, even though Biden covers it up, and so does Bibi fairly well, but it's now being exposed given the tensions of the war. We do need to keep in mind that both of those individuals may be gone in 9 months. It's quite possible. And so that whole condition that you pointed out, Micheline, may no longer be a factor, and I keep wondering whether Bibi is counting on that to ride it out as long as he can until the election, just the way Vladimir Putin is in Ukraine. So it is the right track. I think it's the only track. Lots of obstacles to it, but it's the only one that provides a solution that meets the conditions of both sides.
Okay, we'll let David Goldfischer wants to respond 1 minute, and then I'll ask you questions with respect to the Israeli-Palestinian conflict.
Just to highlight what Gary was saying, in terms of the strategic cost of having Bibi Netanyahu wedded to Jewish power, the extremist right of Israel. When you think about the two-state solution, you can think about it rhetorically, talking about it, negotiating toward it, and actually achieving it. The cost for Israel at this point, and well, let's put it this way, the benefit to Israel at this point of having a prime minister who would say, yes, we are open to negotiating a two-state solution, would immediately transform the optics of the region and immediately put on Hamas the question, are you ready to join us? To which they would immediately say, absolutely not. And for all of the Arab governments watching this on the sidelines, it would give them more space to potentially step in the direction of backing Israel and moving towards a solution. But of course, as Gary said, Netanyahu cannot do that without losing power immediately, and that's really tragic.
Well, I'm glad to see you could not only be an advisor to Trump, but also to Benjamin Netanyahu. Maybe we can try to be also an advisor to Biden. Biden is under domestic political pressure from the progressive wing of his party, and particularly young voter of his support for Israel. Should he take this into account as he runs for the presidency of 2024? Trump seems quiet for a while. He has not talked about that, just saying that everything Biden is doing is wrong. But would he have done things really differently with respect to U.S. support to Israel following October 7? What are your thoughts?
My first thought is I can begin to sense how long it's going to be a problem for me in this building that I channeled Donald Trump for a few minutes. And I'll just leave aside any more discussion of what Trump might or might not do. As far as Biden, yes, this is an election year. The most critical thing from my perspective, and I'm sure for many in this audience, issue in this election is the democracy of the United States, the continuation of the United States as a democracy, as a liberal democracy. And yet we see, as electoral politics unfolds, we're seeing, well, in the narrowest case, the case of Michigan with a large Arab population, it's a battleground state where the difference of 500 or 10,000 votes could decide the election in Trump's favor. And Biden already has to consider the price he may be paying for not going far further in condemning Israel to the point, for example, of cutting off weapons shipments as a way of appeasing people in Michigan who might be disinclined, probably not inclined to vote for Trump, but more inclined to stay home as a result of this. And then there's the issue of progressive young Democrats throughout the United States who have embraced this in a kind of good versus evil with little historical context, little appreciation for the complexities of what's going on. It's good versus evil. Biden has sided with evil. And it's a kind of locked in, and of course, many have been speculating about how to contextualize what's going on, but that's a reality. And short of what seems extremely unlikely right now, of some sort of breakthrough with a ceasefire and then a step in that 5% direction that Gary mentioned, Biden is going to be saddled with this. And so the unknown is whether, as Election Day approaches, this sizable group of young people who feel mobilized in support of the Palestinian cause, whether they will, again, it's hard to imagine that group of progressive Democrats casting a vote for Donald Trump. But in an election that, as of now, is neck and neck, or maybe favoring Trump given our weird electoral politics system and the situation of the battleground states, it will not take that many young people staying home, let alone failing to be out there knocking on doors for Biden, to determine the election. And it's just a sad fact of the level of education and level of information and understanding in that part of our population, for which we who teach at the university have to bear some responsibility, but that's where it is right now.
Well, thank you. I would like to take the opportunity, you guys were sort of stick to the time more or less, which is great. I would like to invite Dr. Ahmed Abdurabu to come here to the podium with Reza Marhin, who is a PhD student here, who I'm very proud of, and has very promising future. At least I'm raising the bar now. You have to do something about this. So why don't you just both come to the podium? We were going to collect questions. Meanwhile, either the moderators now or the audience can start asking questions. So please join us. Well, I will take one question while we are waiting for do you want to?
Good evening, ladies and gentlemen. I'm just going to be reading some of the questions from the audience. So this is not targeted at anyone special. So your thoughts on how to police Gaza after the fighting stops. So what do you think? Like, who is going to be leading that region after the fighting stops?
I'll take a shot at that. I mean, this is, my sense is that it's going to take some type of international peacekeeping force to come in and be the interim security force there in Gaza. I can't see any other way. Hamas is certainly not going to go back. The Israelis certainly aren't going to try to go in there and stay. It's got to be some type of multinational force. How long they're going to stay there, I don't know. But I think that, as has already been said here, I think the discussions on how this ends and what the final solution is it's a decades-long discussion. So I think we're going to have a multinational peacekeeping force, probably mixed military and police for a long time.
Is that possible without a complete demilitarizations of Hamas to have an international peacekeeping force?
It remains to be seen how well the Israelis do. You know, if they can eliminate the battalions that remain in Rafah, find the weapons that are stashed around there, I suspect that Israel, with our assistance, can make a case to the United Nations that this is safe enough to put in a force, and the force may well be armed. It may not just be an unarmed UN Truth Supervision organization like I was part of in Egypt. I mean, that it's going to need to be armed to be successful there.
Okay.
I actually don't think that the UN would do well. The UN might approve it, but there are conversations taking place already on that subject. There's some information trickling out, interest on the part of the Egyptians, the Jordanians, Emiratis, the Saudis perhaps bankrolling it, the Americans providing backup support in terms of logistics, communications, intelligence, and so forth. So there seems to be a willingness. General Casey brings up a really good point, and that is the extent to which Hamas is still a force. And if the Israelis are completely gone, what would Hamas do with this force? Would they attack an all-Arab force? The optics change a lot when it's Arabs enforcing security. And it's mostly a peacekeeping force, but they're also there to enforce order. I also think they would be armed. I can't imagine any country sending their forces to this area unarmed. We certainly wouldn't do it, and I don't think we would expect any others to do it. I think there is probably a plan already in train once we get to the point where the Israelis are ready to truly withdraw, and we can send someone in to maintain order.
Well, we know that the IDF has pulled out some of its forces just as of this week, but at the same time is speaking about intervening in Rafah and occupied Rafah. So an interesting deterrent strategy during these conversations about the ceasefires and the hostage release. Do you want to add something?
Just to point out, I'm not sure it's a dilemma, but things pointing in opposite directions. I think on one hand, the leaders of the Sunni Arab states, particularly the Saudis and the Emiratis, are deeply interested in the defeat and replacement of Hamas. It's no longer, the issue of Israel in the Middle East and the Sunni-Shia divide, which were really separable for a long time, aren't anymore. There is a geopolitical need on the part of the Sunni Arab states and Israel, given their threat from Iran, to form some sort of a joint response. So on one hand, there is a tremendous incentive for some combination of Arab forces to participate and Arab leaders to sanction, and a deep engagement in this process that day after that we hope to envision, where Hamas is no longer ruling in Gaza. On the other hand, these are countries that are desperately afraid of getting involved. The Saudis never set a step into Yemen, despite being at war in Yemen and bombing it from the air, because their own troops are completely unreliable. The UAE, which has a better armed force, did not do well in Yemen either. This is not, yes, some UN peacekeeping mission. One can expect there would be violence, and only an effective ability to respond would make it possible. So I just wanted to point out those sort of opposite pressures.
I'm just sitting here thinking, what would Iran's role be? Would they work to destabilize the peacekeeping force? I suspect they probably would.
Back to you.
So an audience member is curious about the influence that we have over Israel. They ask that we are giving them about $5 billion a year in financial support and military support. Do we have any way to impose or force upon them, meaning the United States or the global community, via sanctions or other means for them to maybe stand back a little bit, release the pressure on the Palestinians?
Yeah, this is a question that has been widely debated. Any of you want to start?
The actual figure that we've been giving Israel, and it's for security, is $3.8 billion. It was negotiated under President Obama in his administration. Of course, there's a pending additional package that's combined with Ukraine and Taiwan that's hung up in Congress. And so we don't give any more financial support to Israel, just the security support. And in terms of the leverage that gives us, it gives us a lot of influence. The United States is never going to tell Israel, do this or else. We have done it once or twice, but not when the country's in the midst of a war. And I don't think we would do it in this case, certainly not Joe Biden. I mean, Joe Biden has been involved in this issue since he was a junior member of the Senate in the late 1970s. I mean, if there's one person in America who has a pretty deep understanding of this issue, it's Joe Biden. And he's pretty strongly wedded to Israel and supporting Israel, despite the very strong position he's taken with Bibi Netanyahu. So it gives us a lot of influence, and I think we saw that in the most recent phone call he had with Netanyahu, where he got an immediate response. The Israelis agreed to open 2 additional entry points for humanitarian goods into Gaza. And I think the space between Bibi and Biden is probably not as great as a lot of people make it out to be. Both of them agree that Hamas has to be neutralized in terms of a military threat to Israel and its governing capability in Gaza. Both of them are absolutely in sync on that. It's the tactics, and particularly when it comes to Rafah. And therefore, I just don't see the United States, other than exerting influence where we see it really, really necessary, and it is. Israel made a colossal mistake in not considering the humanitarian impact of the war once it went into Gaza in full force. It was a colossal mistake. I think a secondary mistake is prohibiting international media from covering the war, so we started getting very biased reports, whether it's coming from pro-Palestinian or pro-Israeli, but even Western reporting was at arm's length because we couldn't get war correspondents who have lots of experience covering wars, whether it's Iraq, Afghanistan, Sudan. So I think in the end, Biden is going to have to use the influence that he has, particularly in terms of the relationship he has developed with not only Netanyahu, but with all of Israel.
Okay, thank you. At the same time, we have discussed just before about the domestic pressures that Biden is experiencing, and that might actually counter that convergence, potential convergence of interest between Bibi and Biden that you suggest. So time will be, the jury's out on this one. Can you just...
If I could, just 2 quick points here.
I will, General, ask you to just look at the time. So 1 minute.
When I say quick,
Such a pleasure for me to tell a general 1 minute. You have no idea.
I would have been finished already. This is a lesson in international relations I learned here 44 years ago, and it's ingrained in my mind. Countries will always act in their own interest, or at least think they are. So we have influence, but we can't tell people what to do, no matter what. And then the second thing I'd say is, I was at a interview in Washington a couple of weeks ago with Jake Sullivan and David Ignatius, and he was asked, and Jake Sullivan was asked this particular question, and he said, "We're nowhere close to conditioning aid."
Thank you very much. You really stuck to that 1 minute.
Less than a minute.
Go ahead.
So we have a couple of questions about the two-state solution. I'm just going to combine a few. So can there be a Palestinian state without the mission of wiping Israel off the map? And in practice, what do you think that the U.S. government and the Arab states in the Middle East can do differently in order to reach that two-state resolution, different than what we are doing right now?
Interesting question. That's thinking out of the box. So please, gentlemen, who wants to start? David, since you were eager to take my microphone.
I don't want to start, but as I mentioned earlier, right, you can think of this, just even talking about it is impossible for Netanyahu. He would lose power. Negotiating toward it would immediately raise, among many other issues, the issue that question raises. The U.S., throughout the Cold War, obviously had no problem dealing with friendly dictators, meaning anyone who was opposing the Soviet Union. When the Cold War ended, the U.S., under Clinton especially, dropped that policy generally, worldwide, of supporting dictators. There was no threat, except for in the Middle East. where Iran was still seen as a threat and the Saudis were seen as a reliable ally. And so the US did not, with the brief exception of Bush at the onset of the invasion of Iraq, talking about freedom and democracy in the Middle East, it never became a serious operational policy. But if a Palestinian state is under negotiation, the question becomes, what are its politics? Clearly, it cannot be a jihadist authoritarian regime. But all of these countries in the region, which are dictatorships, pro-Western dictatorships, would then be in a position of having to envision some form of democracy with regular elections inside of a Palestinian state, because it's really impossible to imagine even a very different Israeli regime accepting an authoritarian dictatorship that was potentially receptive to renewing an effort to destroy the Jewish state. So that issue of democracy and human rights in the Middle East, which one endlessly tries to ward off in the interest of pursuing pragmatic policy, if it does come to that fortunate point, that will be an inescapable question.
Thank you. 1 minute, gentlemen. No, I will answer something. Okay, just try out. It seemed to me that this is an interesting question that is as old as the Oslo Agreement, and we have not yet resolved it. I think that part of the problem, it's not just that we would like to see a two-state solutions based on human rights and democracy, just the way David Goldfischer suggested, by the very stakeholders who are interested in pushing this forward are not always democratic parties. Egypt is not a democracy. Jordan is not really a democracy itself. The Gulf countries are not democratic themselves. So even though they are driving forces for a peace process, they are not really the most likely stakeholders that really want to focus on that aspect of the question, which indeed provide a longer level of stability if that were to happen. So what can be done short of that? That's a big question. I was always surprised and appalled after living in the Arab world during the Arab Spring to see the lack of economic development in those countries. In fact, the Arab Spring, we all know, were pushed. I mean, the uprising, the driving force of the uprising was the high level of unemployment that exists in the region. 40% of the young populations could not find job. A very low trade exists between different Arab countries. So what it seemed to me and suggested to me that what was missing and what was a driving force for conflict was sort of elevating the economic index, certainly for many young Arabs in the region. So how do we do that? That's a big question. So one of the arguments that I've written in a book of mine was to think more in sort of the bigger Rooseveltian traditions about large-scale economic development. I had this crazy but not completely stupid idea as it comes out to create perhaps or rekindle that idea of a train that could just simply go between different states and create employment and create trades between different states. Sort of one of many ideas that could push for economic development. Because short of human rights and democracy, and I'm a professor of human rights and it's close to my heart, one has to actually create a situations of economic diversity, rise of economic employment to make sure that people are able to also talk that conversation, to take this conversation. And so what I would hope is that whoever Biden is listening to, perhaps David Goldfischer, but whoever is listening to should really focus a little bit on changing a little bit the argument about how peace processes work. It's not just a handshake. It's not just a deals about arms. It's also about raising the livelihood and the prospect of a young population that has nothing to do but going to war if they don't have jobs. So on that note.
We have two questions about Iran. The first one is, given Iran's increasing nuclear capabilities, how might diplomatic and defense strategies change in the future? And the second one, I think it's going back to Ambassador Grappo comment about the US supporting democratization wherever it is, even if it's an ally country. The audience asked that the US failed to support Iran's 2009 uprising, for which President Obama expressed regret. 2017 uprisings, 2019 uprisings, and the 2022-2023 revolutionary uprisings in Iran, for which the people of Iran, I think, very clearly expressed their discontent with this regime, wanting a revolution for a secular democracy. How can the US and the world change their strategy in the future with regards to Iran?
Thank you, Reza. I'm sure that I will ask you to answer your question after that. But any of you want to start? It's not an easy question.
The United States now is in our 45th year of failed policy on Iran, which is hard to contemplate. And I will say several administrations have tried to reach out. Bush 41 tried. And in my first assignment to Oman, I knew about a letter that the Omanis had delivered on behalf of Bill Clinton to the Supreme Leader. And both of those came to naught. And then we heard about the JCPOA, which, despite its many flaws, I think was a significant and very positive step forward and could have produced perhaps something even better were it not for President Trump's decision to withdraw from the agreement. This is going to sound like heresy, particularly for someone who worked in the State Department, in the Middle East Bureau, but I think we have to start looking at how we can reach a détente with Iran. This is not a government that's ever going to agree with the United States or even negotiate with the United States. The negotiations that David referred to that were undertaken by the Biden administration for, I don't know, they went on for a year and a half or so. Those were indirect. That is, we had to go through an intermediary because the Iranians wouldn't meet with us face to face. I've done those with the Israelis and the Palestinians. It's very frustrating. You can't communicate through someone else. Well, you can, but not very effectively, and especially with someone like the Iranians. So we'll have to find a way to reach some kind of détente, establishing very firm red lines with the Iranians about actions that they might take that would provoke a strong U.S. military response directly against Iran. Number one being taking of American lives. Number two, reaching the threshold level for the enrichment of uranium and moving forward in the production of a nuclear weapon. Those are two very clear red lines we could establish. And then no withdrawing from any of the sanctions without compensating actions on the part of the Iranian government. But we have failed repeatedly to change this government's thinking. Just looking at the time horizon, the current supreme leader is not going to be around for much longer, so they say. I've been saying that now for a number of years. He's in his mid to late 80s. Whoever replaces him is going to be a very, very conservative cleric. If it is a cleric, it could become a military dictatorship run by the IRGC without the Islamic rhetoric that we've been seeing. Which would tremendously reduce, I think, some of the political pressure that the government is facing. Not entirely, though. But I don't see the United States, certainly with regime change, affecting change within Iran. I think we're going to have to leave it to the Iranian people.
Okay, thank you. Reza, you're welcome to push back any time.
Thank you. I was a student and political activist in Iran before I came to the US. And it might be very interesting for most of you to know that this is a completely non-partisan comment. That President Donald Trump in Iran is extremely popular. It's not because of his personality. It's not because of his conservative points of views. Because Iranians nowadays are very much liberal. They believe they want a secular democracy. But he was very much favored, and I think he still is very much favored in Iran because he understood one thing, that the Islamic Republic regime in Iran only understands the language of force. The data also shows this. From 2015 to 2018, the number of executions hostage-taking activities, international hostage-taking activities of the regime within the region, and the number of proxy wars within the region actually increased. From 2018 to 2020, that number decreased, even though we had 2 major protests inside of Iran. So the maximum pressure policy that President Trump implemented, even though I was one of the people who actually had a very hard time living in that situation in Iran, we supported it because even though we did not have the means to survive, the regime didn't either. And many other people did not die in the region either. So the maximum pressure policy, I think it was something that worked. It was giving results. The data also proves it. And I think something similar to that will also have the support of the people of Iran as they have indicated support for such a thing. But the most important thing, I believe, is for us to stop talking with this murderous, authoritarian, theocratic regime, because they are only going to look out for themselves and not for the people of Iran. So when we are negotiating with the Islamic Republic regime, we are not negotiating for the safety, security of the region or the people of Iran. It's just for the sake of the security of the regime, and all of the financial support that is also released goes into war activities and proxy activities within the regime.
Isn't it interesting when an Iranian really push for further sanction and embargo, an American official calls for detente? I think this is those are the type of perspective we like. Can you just take us with another question?
Yes, absolutely. So, will the U.S. suspend arms deals to Israel? And if so, what do you think the necessary steps could be for that to happen?
I think I can answer that. I think the answer is no, at least in the foreseeable future. And again, that came right out of the mouth of the National Security Advisor. So I think it's pretty well a given in the near term here.
Yeah, I agree. But just to bring in the electoral politics dimension, on one hand, Biden has to fear the progressives in his own party. On the other hand, we can already see Republicans sensing his drift toward being more critical towards Israel as an opportunity for them electorally, not just for American Jews, who would be the obvious target, but for evangelical Christians for whom Israel can do no wrong. And so his ability to move in either direction, I agree with the general, he's not inclined to cut off funds for Israel. But in this electoral year, that could be an even greater disaster than moving too far in the other direction.
Thank you. Do you have another question?
So this is a question I think is a pushback to mine. The agreement with Iran that Trump pulled out of, a lot of pro-Israel people were harmed by that. What was the essence of the effects of the U.S.-Israel agreement? Does that make sense?
No.
No. Okay. So we're just going to move.
Sorry. Maybe you want to repeat or...
Yeah.
Okay, go ahead.
You know, my handwriting is terrible. There was one word that threw everything off. The agreement that Trump pulled out of, a lot of Israel, Netanyahu, and a lot of pro-Israeli people saw that agreement as a really bad thing for Israel. David, you said that there were a lot of lies that were told about that. You made it sound like the agreement was a good thing for everybody. I'm just curious as to what the details of that agreement were and how much was truthful for what Trump said and how much was untruthful.
Netanyahu he's a great speaker. He's a very convincing man. You may recall at that time, he was invited by the Republican Speaker of the House without Obama being informed to address a joint session of Congress. All of the arguments you heard coming from Republicans were all of Bibi's talking points. To start sorting it, were many aspects in which that agreement was challenged. There's no chance here to begin to go into the different controversies surrounding that agreement. My basic conclusion was, aside from reading a lot about it myself, was that every serious nonpartisan expert, including the physicists who negotiated the agreement on behalf of the United States, were in complete agreement that the agreement achieved, in essence, what it claimed to achieve. And as I said, even though there were parts of it that expired in 2024, it's a very complex agreement. But I mentioned at the beginning the key aspects. And the bottom line, just to put it as simply as possible, is that Iran moved from what was generally regarded as being 2 or 3 months away from the bomb when the interim agreement took place a little before 2015, and being 1 year from the bomb up until at least 2031 as a result of the agreement. They're now, as I said, between 3 days and 3 weeks away as a result of Trump's pulling out.
So monitoring was important in this respect. Any other questions from the audience? You can stand up. Oh, okay, so gentlemen just behind. Can you just bring the microphone to Charles, I believe, correct? And then I'll take other questions from the audience. I guess you were deterred by the handwriting and the capacity to read you. We're just asking for a refund just as we speak.
Check, check.
Perfect. Okay. Perfect. Hello, my name is Charles Templeton. I'm a Jumpstart student. And firstly, I'd like to say I appreciate this opportunity to ask a question. And thank you to General Casey for visiting my graduate class last Monday. It was a great discussion. So my question is for General Casey. It's pretty specific.
The lead into the hard question.
Of course. Yeah, in 2007, Iraq saw the Al-Askari Mosque bombing, which played a key role in spurring factional violence between the Sunnis and Shias. However, it seems that responsibility for the bombing hasn't been conclusively established, and I'd like to know if there are any details that you can share pertaining to that event while you were Chief of Staff.
No, in fact, it was 2006. It was February 2006. And we never could conclusively figure out who did it. I suspected it was Al-Qaeda, but in that culture, you can really get convoluted and think that the Shias did it just to rip the scab off the sectarian violence that was going on then, but at a very low level. And I'll tell you that fundamentally changed what was going on in Iraq. And over a period of months after that, it went from a struggle against us, a counterinsurgency against us, to a struggle for the division of political and economic power among the Iraqis, where we were trying to keep both sides from hurting each other, sometimes not very successfully. But it was a significant change in the environment there, and led to, some people say, a civil war. It was certainly a huge internecine battle, and it took us over a year to calm things down and move things forward, so we could ultimately leave.
Thank you very much. Other people in the audience, I saw this lady over there. If you wouldn't mind bringing just counting.
Check, check.
Thank you very much to all of you. It's been a great evening, very informative. One of you alluded to the fact that many of the pro-Palestinian demonstrators seem to present Israel as the evil and the good versus evil. So me, as a layperson, how would you recommend how I would respond to somebody that comes out with that argument? without having all the background knowledge that you people have. Thank you.
Well, I'll answer. Just get educated, come to our events, read. It's very difficult to, at any side, actually, you know, we always welcome critical thinking and education. That's what the purpose of those events are. So maybe that's the first way to answer the people who are wondering about what is going on. Just make sure that they know what they talk about.
There's no shortage of really sound analysis on what's taken place in this conflict. You pick a date when you want to start it. It can be pre-1948, it can be post-1948. And to David's point, I know many folks, probably younger folks, since they weren't around to see it, are not aware of how close the Israelis and Palestinians came in 2000. I mean, literally, they were this close. This was at the Camp David talks that were hosted by Bill Clinton, wherein Ehud Barak showed up with a plan and negotiated with the Palestinians who did not have a plan. But nevertheless, tried to negotiate and came extraordinarily close to achieving all of their objectives. Some of them they did fully achieve. And at the last moment, Yasser Arafat withdrew. To the great frustration and actual anger of Bill Clinton. If you read his biography, he talks about it. And it didn't end there. He continued pursuing this with his Clinton parameters. He again got the Israelis to sign on to this. And Yasser Arafat, at the 11th hour, pulled out. And I will tell you that in my subsequent discussions with Palestinians, including their chief negotiator, they privately confided in me that they made a colossal mistake in walking away from Camp David, which was the saddest thing I've ever heard. It almost brought tears to my eyes. And he wasn't the only Palestinian who told me that they had come so close to achieving almost all the things that they had wanted. And for want of a few details, and I don't want to minimize those, they couldn't close the deal. And it subsequently, only within the last 5 or 6 years, it became a public knowledge that the Saudis and the Egyptians, when they learned of this and what Arafat had walked away from, were shocked that he had gotten so much from the Israelis and had turned it down. And of course, subsequently, it was we saw the start of the second Intifada, which ended up alienating every Israeli, well, practically every Israeli, toward anything having to do with negotiations with the Palestinians.
So in other words, a long history of conflict, but also a long history of peace efforts that students should learn about in order to sort of balance and sort of getting hope as they move forward. But you know, students wouldn't remember 2000, they forgot the pandemic. So of course, why would they remember anything? So anyone else wants to? Peter?
Yes, thank you very much. My name is Pete Parker. And first of all, thank you to all the speakers tonight. It was fantastic. My question is, on roughly the eve of the October 7th invasion into Israel, there was a Saudi Arabia and Israeli agreement that was about to go into effect, which was going to be monumental. Do you think that agreement will ever come back to be?
It wasn't about to go into effect. It was under negotiation, and the United States was obviously extraordinarily involved in trying to facilitate this, which would have been transformative, I think, for the entire region. Because with Saudis normalizing their relationship with Saudi Arabia, it really would have brought along most of not only the Arab world, but the Muslim world. Now, there would have been a few holdouts. Obviously, Iran, Syria, and you can name off the ne'er-do-wells of the Middle East who would have opposed it, but for the most part, it would have been transformative. Those efforts have stopped, but I think both Saudi Arabia and the United States and Israel are still very much interested in making this happen. But now back then, there was less talk about what to do about the Palestinians. Today, I don't think you can have that conversation. Saudi Arabia normalizing its relations with Israel without, as I had mentioned earlier, a very clear horizon for the Palestinians in terms of their own state. With that kind of a commitment on the part of Israel, not even negotiating it yet, because I think everyone understands that would be years in the making. And I say years, minimum of 5 years. That's if you're an optimistic diplomat. If you're practical, it's probably more like 8 to 10 years, because we have lost so much since 2000. We have walked back effectively to 1948, only with much more modern weapons, by the way, far more modern weapons. So the prospect of that is very much in play, and I think the three relevant sides want to see it happen.
Thank you. The gentleman here, would you bring the microphone to him? Please stand up and say who you are.
Hi, I'm Peter Shumway. I'm a sophomore international studies student here. Thank you, gentlemen, so much for being here. It's an honor to listen to you guys speak. My question is, obviously the Hamas conflict has dominated discourse recently, but the coming potential conflict between Israel and Hezbollah could make Gaza look like a dust-up. So my question is, what are the U.S.'s options for mitigating and preventing a conflict between Israel and Hezbollah? And how does Israel's change in risk tolerance after October 7th factor into these calculations?
Started with General Casey.
Thanks a lot. Yeah. The diplomats throw the general in the fire here. I think what I keep reading in the newspaper is Iran does not want this to escalate into a confrontation with the United States. I don't know if that's true or not, but it seems to be out there. To me, the way of containing Hezbollah is to make sure that Iran knows that the consequences of them supporting a significant Hezbollah attack and basically opening another front on Israel would be met with significant consequences. So I think that controlling Iran is the key to keeping Hezbollah under control. Now, that said, there was an article in the paper this morning about Iran is pumping weapons into the West Bank. So on the one hand, they're saying, we don't want this to escalate. On the other hand, they're escalating. So I think that, one of the things I said that the United States needed to do was to contain this and keep it from escalating. But that is certainly something that could put us in a confrontation with Iran, and that would be a significant, I would think, a significant setback for what we're trying to accomplish in the Middle East.
It is indeed always a hops and shores between containment and escalation. So do you want to take it from me?
Just wanted to reinforce, it's a deterrence situation. Right after October 7th, the U.S. sent 2 aircraft carrier groups to the Eastern Mediterranean. A strong signal to Hezbollah, really to Iran, because Hezbollah will listen, presumably, to Iran in this case. And that is very much, part of the dynamic of this situation, is the U.S. continuing to show a complete willingness to escalate. It's a competition, and Iran is no doubt thinking that the U.S. preserves escalation dominance should things go to all-out war. So it's a situation where, being hawkish in terms of making credible threats, which is what the U.S. has been doing, and possibly behind the scenes, not just by sending aircraft carriers. That's part of this dynamic. Hezbollah also remembers a war in 2007 with Israel, in which a very large number of Lebanese civilians died. And as horrible as that was, that also establishes a deterrent in the minds of Hezbollah. That doesn't prove that things cannot get out of hand, but I'm just suggesting there are powerful forces on all sides for restraint.
Hassan Nasrallah, the leader of Hezbollah, after that war, 2006 war against Israel, which by all objective measures, was won by Israel, but was claimed as a victory not only by Hezbollah, but by many others in the region, simply because they survived. But Nasrallah publicly stated his regret for entering into that war because of the devastation it caused in Lebanon and the loss of life. I don't think he's interested in escalating this into a war, but wars can start unintentionally, as we all know. The one final factor that I think is critically important in all of this is Hezbollah is a strategic weapon of Iran, and it's intended to forestall an attack by Israel against Iran. Hezbollah has some 150,000 rockets, probably half of which are precision guided now. Most of Hezbollah or Hamas's were not, and Hezbollah had a tenth of that. So Hezbollah is capable of inflicting great harm, damage, devastation on Israel. But they're not there to, Hezbollah is not there, as they claim, to defend Lebanon against Israel. They're there to defend Iran against Israel. And I don't think Iran is prepared to risk that asset, which is probably their single most valuable asset in confronting Israel and even the United States in the region, by escalating this conflict with Israel. There's nothing in it for them, for Iran. And for that reason, I think Hezbollah, despite the escalation we have actually seen on the border, is not going to escalate this to a full conflict.
Thank you. I'm going to just move to Ahmed in a second. But in what you say, in other words, is that Hezbollah everything to lose in this process of escalation, but perhaps because it has everything to lose, that it has nothing to lose as well. So that's an interesting way to think about the potential escalations.
Yeah,
Ahmed.
I have a question and a comment. So let me start by the comment, and mainly I want to comment to Ambassador Grappo, because I have very different perspective, or at least different image about what really happened back in 2000 with Yasser Arafat. I claim, based on my knowledge, that it's true that Yasser Arafat walked away, but it wasn't because he was offered everything. No. One big thing he was not offered was Jerusalem. And that was a big, and is, and will be still a big deal whenever you speak of the two-state solution. Yasser Arafat was, if you remember, that was the very last few days of Clinton being in power, and he was invited to Camp David, and he was really pressured to sign the two-state solution without having Jerusalem, which was already unilaterally considered by Israel as the only unified capital of Israel in 1981. So in my point of view, had he signed this agreement, he would have been assassinated back home as soon as he made it back. The idea that Egypt was surprised, I'm not sure, even though I'm a very big critical of the Egyptian government, but Hosni Mubarak made it very clear to Clinton in a phone call back in 2000 that no, Yasser Arafat can never walk away from Camp David without getting Jerusalem, or at least part of it, or or at least an international status of Jerusalem as the UN resolution supported. So this is just my only comment on why Yasser Arafat walked away without signing the agreement. And in my point of view, it wasn't feasible to leave the United States signing an agreement for a two-state solution without addressing the question of Jerusalem. And I claim, maybe I'm wrong, but I claim any current or future Palestinian leader will never dare to sign an agreement of a two-state solution without getting something. I guess they might give up the right of refugees. They might accept some, middle ground solutions, but no one, in my point of view, at least to my understanding, no one from the future or current or past Arab or Palestinian leaders will be able to give up Jerusalem. Now, my question is for the title of today's event, America's Changing Rule in the Middle East. I didn't see so far from what you've made any real change, any substance change in the American foreign policy under Biden. Maybe the only positive thing is when Biden just made it very clear that a two-state solution is, the only possible way to solve this, which I agree with, but like I don't see any big change, and correct me if I'm wrong. Thank you.
Thank you very much. David, you want to take this?
I'm not going to return to the change represented by future President Trump, but yeah, there has been continuity, again, since the U.S. assumed a world leadership role, and that means, on the economic side, that the U.S. economy, the presumption is benefited by a stable and prosperous world economy. If someone is shutting down shipping in the Gulf of Oman or the Red Sea, that has consequences for the world economy. Either the U.S. will be taking the lead in preserving open sea lanes globally, or nobody will. It's a continuity. I think in that sense, with the exception of the presidency of Trump, and by the way, yeah, you can read shelves of books about paths not taken in so many different aspects of U.S. policy toward the Middle East. But again, in that basic sense of preserving stability, of supporting status quo states like the Saudis, for better or worse, and during the period they were supporting violent Islamist extremism for the worst, but supporting status quo states which are likely to protect the flow of oil, stability in the region, against expansionist states, whether it was the Soviet Union or Iran or Iraq, and now particularly Iran again. Again, mistakes will be made. People will debate tactics and even strategy. But in terms of that set of objectives, there is a basic continuity. But again, it's not given. It's not just presented as a rule on earth. It is simply a conclusion that began with FDR, was implemented in a radically different international environment by Harry Truman. The Republicans came on board, and that basic strategy, in that essence, I don't think changes.
To your point about no Palestinian leader being able to sign a significant agreement with Israel, I was at the parade. Right. But I was at the parade when Anwar Sadat was shot, and that sent an awful strong signal to Arab leaders around the world about what fate might await them for making peace with Israel. The second point, and I just lost the train to that question. Changing policy. Yeah, from a military perspective, obviously it's significant. I mean, I had 160,000 troops in Iraq. They're not there, and for 20 years, we prosecuted a war against Islamic extremism, and we basically have contained that to the point it can be prosecuted without a significant U.S. ground presence in the Middle East, and that's basically gone. They're small groups working with local governments to basically keep the terrorists under control. And so, for me, from a military perspective, that's a fundamental change, and that's part of the reason you see the emphasis shifting toward what's going on in the Asia-Pacific region.
Yeah, one may say actually that sometimes good things happen after the worst possible tragedies. And I'm not an advocate of providential design. I think it's a problem and a mistake to do something of that sort. But one may hope, when we talk about change, that perhaps the eradication of Hamas, which ultimately hijacked populations and created with Israel a major humanitarian disasters since October 7, would actually change the configuration of the regions. Hamas removed would mean ultimately Iran is removed. If Iran is removed from Gaza, there will be possibility of stability between Israel and the Palestinians. Hezbollah, as a result of that, would be dramatically weakened as well. So maybe, and here again, I don't think that any word justify peace, but perhaps there will be possibility with great talent to push forward for the possibility of Palestinian governance based on democracy and stability as a result of this terrifying war. Any other question? The gentleman here. No, we don't like yelling students. We're afraid of them. They give us bad reputation. We want you with a microphone.
We working? We are working. Again, thank you everybody for coming in. My name is Kai Kostel. I'm also an undergraduate student here at Corbell, and I'm also an Army cadet, sir. But my question has more pertinence to the historical actions from Israel. So looking at the 1972 Olympics, when they had the assassination of all of the Olympic athletes, they responded very similarly to how the United States responded to other terroristic attacks. They responded with special mission units that we, around the same time in the 70s and 80s, were also developing, same thing as the UK. But I was kind of going along the lines of, in their similar actions abroad in terms of terroristic acts and what they're dealing with right now, their version of a 9/11, and similarities in government, both parliamentary democracy, do you potentially foresee that their power could grow in the future regionally such that they would become another polar power? Not maybe negating Russia or China as our near peers, but containing that power to have a little bit more soft power and hard power in that region, similar to the U.S.
I'm sorry, what country are you talking about?
Israel.
Israel. Have you been reading too many Daniel Silva novels?
No, but I have been heavily influenced by Dr. Goldfischer. Thank you.
I'll take a shot at this and then turn over, but I just think on size alone, I don't think they can generate the capacity to be a regional superpower. I mean, they've got 10 million people, and you can drive from one part of the country in 2 hours. And the other thing that we haven't talked about, but they have a significant reserve population that they're having to mobilize. And when these folks are in the military, they're not doing their job. So it's starting to have a significant economic impact. So I don't know that they have the people or the size that actually they could become a regional superpower. But I don't know. I'm turning it over to people that know the region better than me.
You can't have that kind of power if you're dependent on another country. Israel is dependent on the United States. I mean, it's an extreme, it's probably the most powerful country in the Middle East today. And we could maybe debate Iran, but nevertheless, it's the most powerful country in the Middle East. But I think to reach the level that you're suggesting, they're too dependent on the United States. And therefore, there'll always be a regional power with considerable regional influence, referring to the point that David made earlier, thus the extraordinary interest on the part of Arab Sunni states, the moderate states, to form a much stronger relationship with Israel. It's sensible for a whole variety of reasons, not just security, economic, technology, trade, and so forth. But because of the special relationship with the United States, no, they're always going to look to the United States for the real throw weight in the region.
Thank you. I would take one more question and resume and just concluding. I see a lot of hands and this young lady over there, but you need a microphone.
On it.
Thank you. Hi, my name is Cassis. I'm also an undergraduate student here. I study journalism and international studies. And my question is going back to something that Dr. Goldfischer said earlier about the lack of education in younger voters. So my question is a bit of a counter to that, I guess. How do you think lack of education surrounding the 1948 Nakba, the dispossession of Palestinian land beginning in the early 1900s and continuing through today, and the Israeli government's implementation of apartheid against Palestinians in the occupied West Bank and the blockade of Gaza since 2007 has affected American voters' support for Israel?
Okay, we were waiting for that question. Okay.
I have the answer. No, actually, I know you gave me the microphone, but I don't really, to respond to that question would immediately take us into the intricacies. We could start 3,000 years ago with Canaanite tribes in the region. We could start at the beginning of Zionism. We could start in the aftermath of 1948 when the Arab world expelled or pressured to leave 850,000 Arab Jews who were left homeless, although most found a home in Israel, or that the Arab states refused to grant citizenship except to put the Palestinians in camps where they remain. But I wouldn't even take that position either. These are complexities and there are nuances, and and you're giving me a list of talking points. And I think this is exactly why deep education, reading serious histories of the region, serious histories of that conflict, and not thinking immediately that an answer that clearly lists one side is right and one side is wrong is actually going to take you forward. But I can't engage the debate you're proposing when we have no time.
Well, I did say, do you want to, any of you want to weigh in? No. I did say it's getting more exciting, you know, and okay, so but I have to take one more, and I'm going to go with God, just all of you, what am I going to do? So here's what I suggest. Come at the end of the session. I'm going to take one. I'm going to let Aram choose. Ha.
Oh, no.
Yes, you are.
Who can raise their hand the highest?
And I'm going to ask those of you to come want more and have further discussions with the panelists to come at the end after that one last question. So understand it's already 7:20 and I have to keep the time here going. Aram?
We have a lucky winner.
Thank you.
Okay.
Thank you. I'd like to start off by thanking the panelists for being here and for your time. My name is Griffin Hood. I'm an undergraduate student as well here at the Corbell School. My question is about generational shifts. Firstly, recent polling data suggests that lack of support for Israel is more of a generational basis than in a left versus right basis. Secondly, I'd also like to note on that same point, though, that lack of support for Israel is not necessarily support for Palestine. I think that's a really important distinction to make here. But secondly, on generational shifts, there have been murmurs within the policymaking community that the United States military, if not already, is soon to face a recruiting crisis. Some, especially on the right, would say that this is due to politicization of the military, specifically DEI initiatives, woke, whatever you want to call it, and lowering standards. So, if these generational shifts do come to fruition, mainly lack of support for Israel on either side.
Can you ask a question? The comments
Yes.
are wonderful, but the question is...
I'm trying to. If these generational shifts do come to fruition, meaning lack of support for Israel, and we have a recruiting crisis in the military, how do we expect this to affect U.S. policy in the Middle East and Israel specifically? Thank you.
Always remind me that motto, never believe anyone above 30, but okay, you have a point. So any of you want to address it?
I'll do recruiting if you, so on the recruiting side, it may surprise you, but 1st of July last year was the 50th anniversary of the all-volunteer force. So 1973, on 30th of June, the authority to draft ended. And I actually just wrote a book with some folks about how we should think differently and about how we care for veterans after 50 years of a volunteer force. And as we thought about that, one of the things that we saw was that the 50 years of relying on volunteers has kind of eaten away at a culture of service in the United States. And the issue with recruiting is a little bit of that the erosion of the culture of service. It's a little bit of the wokeness that you talked about. It's a little bit of a perception among women that you can be sexually assaulted in the military, and the military is not doing enough for it. And it's partly something I call the broken veteran narrative. That when you see something, an ad on television for a veteran, they are usually an amputee or in a wheelchair, or you see people think that all veterans are homeless, and it's not the case, but that's the image that people have. And what's happened is the 17 to 24-year-old age cohort, only 9% of them even considering military service, and over half think that if they serve, they'll get post-traumatic stress or some type of physical injury. The reality is there's something called, we all hear about post-traumatic stress. There's something called post-traumatic growth that affects far more people than post-traumatic stress. And that post-traumatic growth is basically you have a traumatic experience, but you come out stronger. And surveys show that 2/3 of the post 9/11 vets that deployed, and that generation of veterans deployed more than other generations of veterans, had a growth experience. They thought they were actually stronger after their combat experience. So all those things have rolled into this recruiting challenge, and it's something that, for me, it's a national problem. It's not a military problem. The military got a lot, will throw a lot of money at it and try to be creative, but it's a national issue.
So a clear solution, you have this part of the stress generation, you should be part of the army now, you will overcome it. Gary?
I fully endorse General Casey's comments. Being a veteran of myself, having served in Southeast Asia during that war, and knowing so many veterans myself, including many whom I met when I served in Iraq, as well as other countries in the Middle East, to the person, they all said they were better for the experience they had in serving their country. And I think there is, and I have to really constrain myself when I talk about public service, because I spent my entire life practically in public service. I took a pay cut when I went into the State Department. I was very well paid working for an international bank. But public service meant so much to me. And there are lots of reasons why I felt this way, but I think the country falls short by not promoting public service. And it's not just in the armed forces. It's across the board. Every American who serves in public service is a better American for it, even if they never put on a uniform. And I would really love to see this country address that issue. But to your point about the impact this could potentially have on our interest in the Middle East, well, it could be very serious. And this is when leadership here in our own country is so vitally important. And with strong leadership, you can communicate why we have to be active in the Middle East, or why we have to do the things we're trying to do in support of Ukraine, or in the Asia theater. So you can argue whether Joe Biden is that leader, but clearly going forward, we're going to need very, very strong leadership if the American people are going to support their country's national security policy. I don't care how brilliant it may be, but without the support of the American people, it's not going to succeed. And we've seen that in the past. So I'm hopeful that, as in the past, leaders will rise to this challenge to be able to communicate to the American public why the role we play in the world today is so vital to us as Americans. But also, it's a very, and I'm not going to try and portray it as that we're out doing we're a bunch of do-gooders in the world. No, we're out to protect and advance our own interests. And everybody, whether they put on a uniform or a coat and tie and works in the State Department or anywhere else, you are all about protecting and advancing American interests. And we have to be able to communicate those. And it's going to take some extraordinary, capable leadership to do that, particularly if you're going to reach young people.
Thank you.
Yeah, I'll just get briefly to that generational issue on Israel, but I, of course, completely endorse these views of the importance of public service. It's also true that American mistakes in the region, and putting aside causes and debates, there's no question that the U.S. involvement in Iraq after 2003 helped discredit the credibility of the mainstream Republican leadership, just as the rise of ISIS under the Obama administration helped discredit faith in the American foreign policy making a lead on the Democratic side, both of which contributed to the election of Donald Trump. And so leaders make mistakes, but that doesn't necessarily mean that the overall objectives are wrong. On the generational side, yes, many analysts have pointed out that early on, the emergence of a state of Israel after the Holocaust was seen as an almost miraculous event which drew a tremendous amount of support. And one can move through the years, which we don't have time to, but it's certainly true that observing the brutal treatment of Palestinians in the West Bank as the settlements expanded and nothing was done to move towards a two-state solution, for a generation growing up exposed to that, there were good reasons to have a very harsh view of Israel. And now, forgetting about who's right, who's wrong, what U.S. policy should be, the optics of Israel allowing the population of Gaza to reach near famine levels in the context of this massive bombing, and again, putting aside what's right, what's wrong, that was a strategic blunder, aside from the morality on the part of Israel, and that deepens for the younger generation the readiness to simply condemn Israel. That gives Israel that's part of a strategy is the optics that shape world opinion and especially United States opinion. And that is now a great added burden for Israel to change the lens through which this generation is viewing that country.
Thank you. The United States has also a long history of perpetuating human rights violations and propping leaders who are anti-democratic. And so the young generations who is critical of US foreign policy is correct to voice its critique, but at the same time, more difficult is to provide solution. So by way of encouragement, I would like you to all think deeply what was done, what could have been done better, and what you could do, inspired by leaders that we have here on the panel. General Casey, thank you for your leaderships. Gary Grappo, thank you for your diplomatic leadership, and David Goldfischer for your views on those questions. I think that the gauntlet is in your camp. You can carry the torch, and we will criticize you. So thank you. A round of applause.